I was convinced that the brain and the immune system communicate, that they talk to each other. Looking at a screen which has blue light for 30 minutes in the evening is as stimulating as a cup of coffee.
Wow.
Humans are social animals, and we need that nurturing support from our colleagues. Quite apart from it also stimulates creative thinking and so on, but it's that emotional social support that's really important.
What would you like to see more of in buildings and in workspaces?
You need to design buildings that incorporate spaces that support social connections. There's a sweet spot for noise level where the relaxation response, the well-being response is optimal, about 40-45 decibels. One of the things that I didn't mention that's really, really important is that
Did you know the space you spend most of your time in could be quietly harming your health? Welcome to Room to Think. Today, I'm sitting down with Dr. Esther Sternberg. She's a neuroscientist, physician, and the author of Well at Work and Healing Spaces. Dr. Sternberg's research connects stress, the brain, and the environments that we live in. In this episode, you'll learn how space directly affects your immune system, your cognition, and your ability to heal. Things like how poor ventilation can dramatically reduce brain performance, to how light, sound, nature, and carbon dioxide levels shape your body without you even noticing. Dr. Sternberg shares the personal experience that changed her career and her health when extreme stress led to illness, and how a radically different environment helped her heal. This episode is full of practical, science-backed insights you can use immediately, whether you're designing an office, working from home, or just trying to feel better in your own space. By the end, you'll understand why your environment isn't just background. It's your biology, and it's acting on your body every single day. Let's get into it.
Dr. Sternberg, what an honor it is to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much for coming on Room to Think.
Well, it's really my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course, thanks for being here. So, Dr. Sternberg is a physician, neuroscientist, and an author whose research explores how stress, the brain, and the environments we inhabit shape human health, resilience, and well-being. She brings this all to life in her books, Well at Work and Healing Spaces, which translate neuroscience and stress research into practical insights for healthier workplaces and everyday environments. Dr. Sternberg, it is truly an honor because as I told you, I've been listening to your book and it is fantastic. There is so much information in it. Before we get into that, for listeners who may recognize your name or your books but don't really know your story, how would you describe what you do and why you do it?
Wow. It's been a journey. So first of all, thank you for having me on this podcast. It's really great. It's been a journey. I started off as a family physician. I then trained as a rheumatologist and arthritis doc. And I fell into a research career serendipitously because of a single patient I saw, and that's a whole nother story. And I was convinced by that patient that the brain and the immune system communicate, that they talk to each other, and that in order to have health, you have to have a healthy connection between the brain and the immune system. And if that connection is broken, you have disease. Well, that was in 1979, 1980, and the majority of my colleagues and scientists and physicians did not believe in the mind-body connection. Some of them were even skeptical about the idea of stress. And in fact, they looked really stressed when you talked about stress. But I was convinced because of that single patient who had received an experimental drug for a fatal form of epilepsy and developed an autoimmune scarring inflammatory disease. And that put me on a research track in order to try to figure out that brain-immune connection. And I trained in Montreal at McGill University. I did all my medical training. I was born in Montreal and grew up there, and eventually went to the National Institutes of Health, where I discovered back in 1989 that the brain's stress center, the hypothalamus, is important in susceptibility and resistance to autoimmune inflammatory diseases like arthritis in rats. And when you can prove that connection in rats, the scientific community begins to believe it. And so that became an important piece of the science of the mind-body connection. In the 1980s and 90s, there were a few of us around the country, around the world, who were studying different pieces of that puzzle. How does the brain send signals to the immune system? Well, it turns out there's lots of nerves that actually innervate immune organs. How does the immune system send signals to the brain when you're sick? Well, there are molecules from the immune system that cross the blood-brain barrier and change how the brain functions. I mean, we all know that. When you're sick, you want to sleep a lot, you lose interest in the outside world, you lose your interest in all of your appetites, in food, sex, you curl up and you go to bed. That's because those immune molecules are making your brain do that. So there's a wealth of information now since the 1980s, 1990s that there really is a brain-immune connection, and that keeping that connection intact is important for health. If that connection is broken, you get disease. So how did I get into place and well-being? Well, back in the year 2000, well, there are two things. One is what happened to me, and then the other was a single question. And I'll tell this story in Well at Work, Creating Well-Being in Any Workspace. I tell some of the story in each of my books, in The Balance Within and in Healing Spaces, The Science of Place and Well-Being. So I'll start with what happened to me. So I was studying the brain-immune connection and discovered that stress was important in illness. And about 8 years later, I went through a period of extreme stress in my own life. My mother was dying of cancer. My father had just died of a 7-year illness that included Parkinson's and dementia. And I was under a lot of stress at work. I testified before Congress on a very controversial issue on which the institute director of my institute was on the other side. So I was under a lot of stress in a lot of domains. I had just moved into a new house, which is another huge stressor, and my mother died. And I was in Washington, D.C. in my new house writing what was to become my first book, The Balance Within, The Science Connecting Health and Emotions. And my new neighbors knocked on the door. They saw me writing on the deck, and they were Greek, and they brought me all kinds of wonderful Greek food, tzatziki, dolmades, moussaka, which, by the way, reminded me of my parents' cooking, my mother's cooking, because they were from Romania, and the food is very similar. So they said, "Are you a writer?" And I said, "I don't know. Why do you ask?" And they said, "We've always wanted a writer to stay in our cottage in Crete." And I said, "I'm a writer." And I went with them to Crete. I had developed, during that period of extreme stress, I had developed inflammatory arthritis. I mean, how ironic is that? An arthritis doc discovers that the stress center is important in susceptibility to arthritis. I go through stress, I get arthritis. It is not a coincidence that I developed the arthritis at that point in time. What happened when I went to Greece was that I felt so much better after I was there for only 10 days or 2 weeks, that when I came back, my doctor said, "What did you do? You don't have to go back into hospital," because I was going to get liver biopsies, more knee biopsies, be on an experimental drug for arthritis. And my doctor said, "You don't need to go into hospital. What were you doing?" Well, what I was doing was, and I didn't fully appreciate this until I moved to the Andrew Weil Center for Integrative Medicine 13 years ago in Tucson, Arizona, I was inadvertently or without realizing it, practicing the 7 domains of integrative health. I was sleeping healthily every night, sometimes under the stars. I was in a wonderful green environment. I was outside in nature. I was breathing fresh, clean air. I was surrounded by the grandmothers of the village and my neighbors, who were all feeding me wonderful, healthy food, a healthy Mediterranean diet. So I had the support of all of these friends and villagers. I was began to move every day. I had been very sedentary. I'd been in Washington. I had been eating French fries and hamburgers and cheeseburgers every day for lunch and sitting in front of a computer. And so I began to slowly walk and eventually climbed to the top of the hill above the village where there was the ruins of a temple to Asclepius, the Greek god of healing. And I would sit there for hours, not realizing time would go by. And I'd look out at the blue Mediterranean and the white stucco buildings and the fuchsia bougainvillea. And I'd listen to the birds and the sheep and the goats and the wind. And I'd be breathing in this wonderful air with the aromas of the lemon and orange trees and eucalyptus. And I didn't realize, actually, until very recently, that I was meditating. That's what meditating is. It's being in the moment. So I was practicing these 7 domains of integrative health. And that's really what made me, I had an aha moment in the middle of that period there, which, by the way, my computer blew the first day because I had the wrong connection. So I couldn't write.
Oh, no.
So my neighbor said, "What are you doing? You're supposed to be writing here." And I said, well, it's actually was better because this way I was able to really immerse myself in the village life and in the life that where they live by the seasons and the sun. And it's a very healthy way of life. I was able to slow down. And that's really what helped me heal. And I realized halfway through that time there that if I continued doing what I was doing in Washington, D.C., being sedentary, being stressed, overworking, burning the candle at both ends, eating hamburgers and French fries, I would continue to get sick. And if I did what I did in Greece, tried to bring a little bit of Greece with me back home, I would continue to heal. And I have kept that with me ever since. That was back in 1997. So what was that's almost 20 years, 30
Almost
years ago.
30, yeah.
Yeah, wow, time flies. And so I planted some jasmine trees on my deck in DC. I planted herbs, and so I could sit in the evening and smell the fragrance of the flowers and the herbs and be quiet and take moments out during the day to just relax. And I went back to what I had been brought up on, a healthy Mediterranean diet, because that was what my mother cooked. And I went back to that. And every time that I do get overstressed, I do try to throttle back and get back into that mode. So thinking about what was it that helped me heal there, that's what contributed to my second book, Healing Spaces. It was what I saw, what I heard, what I smelled, what I did, what I touched in that space. And I became really very aware of how physical environments can help you heal or can harm you. That was in 1997. In the year 2000, my colleague at the U.S. General Services Administration, Kevin Campshire, who at the time was research director at the General Services Administration, came to me at NIH and as a sister agency and asked me, he knew I was studying stress and illness, and he said, "Can you help me measure the impact of the built office environments that the over 2 million office workers, civilian office workers in the federal government were working in, so that he could design these spaces and operate them so that the people in those spaces could be happy, healthy, and productive." What a novel idea, design the spaces to keep people happy. And so that's why we began this work, which we continued through 2025 together using wearable devices, tracking health measures, so stress and relaxation response, sleep quality, psychological responses, mood, and the impact of up to 11 different environmental attributes on those aspects of health and well-being. And we eventually, our last paper from this series of studies where we studied total of 5 federal buildings. And actually, we also studied a couple of private sector buildings. And we came up with basically a prescription for a healthy well-being building. Well, that became really, really important during COVID. As you may recall, there were lots and lots of animations on the internet showing the spread of the virus through the ventilation system and people getting sick because they're sitting under the ventilation system. And that was really important. That was, in many ways, the silver lining of COVID, that people became very aware of how important clean air is in health. And we spend 90% of our time indoors, probably more than that. And it is therefore essential to create indoor spaces to support physical health, which clean air is essential for, but also emotional health. And I think what was lost in the enthusiasm for clean air during COVID is this other need for designing spaces to optimize emotional well-being as well. And that's becoming more and more recognized now, especially after the return to work, because you can clean the air. So first of all, let me emphasize that clean air is essential. If you have a spread of virus, spread of mold, spread of bacteria, you get illnesses like sick building syndrome, Legionnaire's disease, severe allergies. If the ventilation system does not have frequent fresh air turnover, excellent filtration, inline ducts, outflow and intake ducts, you're going to get people sick inside these buildings. So that is absolutely essential, to have clean air. And in fact, I'm a commissioner on a commission now for healthy indoor air that was launched at the United Nations on September 23rd in New York. And it was very exciting to see over 160 representatives there from countries around the world, from companies around the world, from organizations, NGOs, all pushing for clean air. And that's really, really important. It was led by France and Montenegro, and Australia played a very large and important part. International Well Building Institute played a very important part in bringing the whole thing together. So that's really wonderful and very exciting that there is such an impact now and movement in many countries to assure clean air indoors. The other thing that happens if you have poor ventilation is carbon dioxide builds up, because as we're breathing out, we breathe out carbon dioxide, which is different than carbon monoxide, which is a poison. But as you breathe in, you take in oxygen and you breathe out carbon dioxide. And the more people there are in a room, which is poorly ventilated, and the longer they're in there, the more the carbon dioxide builds up. And as carbon dioxide builds up, your cognition, your mental capacities start to fail. So room air, outside air, is about 450 parts per million. At 950 parts per million, you're down to about 85% cognitive performance. At about 2,000 or 1,500 parts per million, you're down to 50% cognitive performance. What does that mean? You're nodding off, you're going to sleep, you're really feeling fatigued, your judgment is poor, you don't realize that you're making mistakes, and you're making a lot of mistakes. So I like to tell my students, if I'm lecturing, if you're starting to fall asleep, it's not me, it's the carbon dioxide, it's the ventilation system. But really, that is very, very important. So, but what happened after COVID, as people began to go back to work, people didn't want to go back to work. Many people, they want to stay home. They want to work from home. And in fact, studies showed that people were just as productive, if not more productive, working from home than working in a common office. So organizations started to mandate people back to work. Well, you can fix the ventilation system till doomsday. if you don't create a space that attracts people to come back to work, they're not going to want to go back to work. Now, many organizations are doing this. They are creating beautiful well-being spaces, but many still can't or don't because of the cost. But in fact, the cost of the personnel is much higher down the road. Over 95% of the cost of an organization comes from the people in that organization. So it's worth the upfront cost to create well-being spaces that embed the 7 domains of integrative health into them. And that's really what Well at Work, Creating Well-Being in Any Workspace talks about. It's how do you do that? Now, I've been talking a lot. Do you have any questions?
No, I have so many questions. So I would love to talk about the 7 domains of health in a space, as well as your move to Arizona and everything that preceded that.
So, as I said, when I was in Greece, I didn't realize that I was practicing integrative health. And the 7 domains of integrative health were defined by the Andrew Weil Center for Integrative Medicine as sleep, resilience, environment, which includes clean air and green environment, movement, relationships, spirituality, and nutrition. And if you engage in all 7 of those activities, those healthy behaviors, then you're going to maintain your health to the best of your possible healthy self. You know, you may not be an Olympic swimmer, but, you know, everybody has an optimal health that they can achieve. I was at the National Institutes of Health, and Dr. Andrew Weil recruited me to go out to Tucson, Arizona, to create a research program and lead a research program at the Andrew Weil Center for Integrative Health. And I did that 13 years ago in 2012. And I learned a lot. Even though I was studying the mind-body connection, I was mostly studying it in rats. And I learned a lot about these concepts of integrative health and how one can intentionally engage in these activities to maintain health. What really attracted me to move out from the East Coast, you know, I told Andy that I'm a big city East Coast girl. I grew up in Montreal. I know snow. The desert is not in my future. But first of all, when I flew out to Tucson, I was completely blown away by the beauty of the place. It's a high desert surrounded by mountains. And also I was blown away by the center and the amazing people in the center and how they were all working together to train physicians and at all levels, medical students through mid-career and many health professionals, nutritionists, massage therapists, yoga, meditation folks, and so on, in this integrative health, whole person health approach to wellness. And so I moved to Arizona, and I have to say it's like living in a spa. I just love it here. I'm much more able to engage in these healthy activities in my own life. I swim every single day. It gets cold at night, but if you heat the pool, you can do it no matter how cold it is. And so it keeps me healthy. And I became aware of the importance of healthy diet, healthy nutrition. At about 2019, Dr. Weil got the go-ahead to build a new building complex, 3 buildings for the Andrew Weil Center. When I moved here, the center was housed in a tiny little 1930s cottage on the university grounds. And, you know, has a beautiful desert garden, but it was not ideal. And so Dr. Weil asked me to convene an advisory committee to be sure that we embed the 7 domains of integrative health into this building complex. And so I did that. The Dean of the College of Architecture, Planning, and Landscape Architecture, several of the faculty, and my colleagues from the U.S. General Services Administration, Kevin Campshire and Brian Gilligan. Kevin, by then, and by the way, by COVID, had become Chief White House Sustainability Officer for the GSA, and director of high performance federal green buildings. So he was able to put into practice all of the research-based discoveries that we had made for creating healthy well-being spaces. And so he and his colleagues advised as well. And we worked closely with the architects of Line and Space to really collaborate and co-create these buildings to be sure that they included elements, the seven domains of integrative health. So we met first to really share information about what does it mean and how do you embed. So what's important for sleep, for example? One of the most important things for sleep is early morning, full spectrum sunlight. Now, it's a little counterintuitive that what you do in the morning impacts how you sleep at night, but that's really important. The more you move, one of the things we found in our studies with the GSA is the more you move during the day, the better you sleep at night. The more you move during the day, the less stressed you are when you go home or when you stop work. And stress impairs sleep, so the less stressed you are, the better you sleep. And we found that, in fact, sleep quality was greatly impacted by these different features, and that people who slept better because they were exposed to early morning sunlight, moved more during the day, had less stress at night, also woke up the next day less fatigued and in a better mood. So, you know, it's hard to intentionally engage in the 7 domains of integrative health. You know, if I tell somebody on New Year's Day, you know, okay, this year you're going to do all 7 things. Well, that's daunting, right? That's totally stressful. But if you do it without even realizing it, because you're in a building that helps you to do that, then you are engaging in those 7 domains without even realizing it. So one of the things that we wanted was glass walls to get lots of circadian light into the building. The architects suggested a very narrow footprint because in order to get light to the people in the middle of the office space, you need a narrow footprint. But then the architects and our building science experts said, but you can't build a glass box in the desert because there'll be heat gain. But there are things you can do to mitigate heat gain. Put in high performance glass, put in shades, external shades that are angled just right to the angle of the sun, have overhangs to create shade. And then our Dean of the College of Architecture, who is also a landscape architect, said, put in mesquite trees on the southern facing wall. One of the interesting stories about that is that when we were walking through the construction site, close to the buildings were finished and they were putting in the desert gardens around, we noticed that there were ironwood trees, not mesquite trees. Well, ironwood trees take a very long time to grow and they're short. And we said to the facilities folks, why did you do that? We wanted mesquite trees. And they said, well, the mesquite trees drop too many pods. If you want to pick up the pods and use the pods for your mesquite flower, you're welcome to do it. But so the architects literally went back to the drawing board and found mesquite trees that have very few pods. And so the bottom line is there is a solution for every potential problem. And if you do this intentionally, you can achieve a building that supports both physical health and emotional well-being, and is sustainable. So that's, you know, reducing heat gain is sustainable design. One of the things that happens when you have so much light coming in is you don't need to turn on the electric lights. So that makes it even more sustainable. So we had we had an advisory meeting to embed the 7 domains of integrative health. Then we had an advisory meeting to make sure the building was sustainably designed, green design. And then then COVID happened. March 2020, everything stopped. We didn't even know if the buildings were going to go forward. Fortunately, thanks to the president of the university, the buildings went forward. But what that pause did is it gave the architects the opportunity to go back and redesign for post-COVID design. And what was the most important thing that they had to redesign was the ventilation system. So they put in an extremely powerful ventilation system with frequent fresh air turnover and inline outflow ducts and intake ducts so that the turbulence was reduced. So we now have 3 buildings: the mind building, the body building, which is also the Cantor building because of a generous donation, and the spirit building. So it really exemplifies the mission of the center: mind, body, spirit. And they are really a flagship for how to embed the 7 domains of integrative health into the built work environment. Now, we did a pre-post occupancy survey. We hired Casey Lindbergh, who's with the University of Colorado Boulder and also HKS, and he designed, he's a PhD psychologist and architect, master's in architecture, and he designed a pre-post occupancy survey to see how the buildings were operating after people moved in. And people love to work there. And in fact, even people in the other parts of the university who don't work there like to come and work in our space. Even the IT guys, who they love to come and help fix our computers because they can spend time in our space. But the way the buildings performed best was really in the way that common office buildings should perform. And that is 85% of the staff felt that they were more connected with their colleagues, more connected with the organization, and more connected with the outside community when they were in the buildings coming to work, compared to which was when they were working from home. So the idea that, yes, you can be more productive working from home, but the thing that you miss is your social interactions, that really important element of the 7 domains of integrative health: relationships. Because, and we know, from former Surgeon General Vivek Murthy, there's really an epidemic of loneliness. Loneliness is associated with shorter lifespans, with many physical illnesses, with high blood pressure, with obesity, with cardiovascular disease, with depression, with suicidality. People who are working continuously from home get Zoom, I don't want to say Zoom, but video conference burnout, video conference after video conference. But if you're working with others, you get that nurturing social support at work, which is so important for health. So, and what happened with COVID is that many organizations had an existential crisis of, why do we even need office spaces? Why should everybody go lockstep to an office building? And it turns out that the really important reason is that social connectedness. Humans are social animals, and we need that nurturing support from our colleagues. Quite apart from it also stimulates creative thinking and so on, but it's that emotional social support that's really important. And so when you think about that, you need to design buildings that incorporate spaces that support social connections, which means you need to have spaces that are smaller, for smaller groups, for more intimate gatherings, for larger groups. And one of the things that we found in our GSA studies was that people who are more introverted preferred quieter, sort of more contained spaces. And people who are more extroverted preferred spaces with lots of stuff going on around. I mean, those are the people who are sitting all day working in the coffee shops, right? I happen to be one of those people, but
Me too.
But the goal then is not for an organization to give everybody a psychology test and see where they stand on the introvert-extrovert scale and say, you work here. That is absolutely not what should be done. What should be done is you should have many choices of many places to go, depending on your personality, depending on the particular kind of work you're doing at that moment in the day, depending on how you feel. If you're not feeling real well, if you're fatigued, you may want a quieter space, even if most of the time you're an extrovert. So people need to self-select and choose where they want to work, and also have spaces where they can gather. one of the things that I didn't mention that's really, really important is that when you think about an office space, we mostly think about the indoors, but it's important to have access to nature. Access to nature is nourishing, it's stress reducing, it helps with resilience. And so easy access to nature and creating gardens around the buildings are really important. And so we put in a beautiful desert gardens with medicinal plants and lemon tree and pomegranate tree and aloe and so on. And our previous executive director, Dr. Victoria Mazes, had recently retired, and we and others at the center created a QR code self-guided walk through the gardens so that people could learn about, and it's called the Victoria Mazes Walk, and people can learn about the medicinal value of aloe, or what is the symbolism of an iron tree, sort of in different indigenous cultures, and so on. And the interesting thing about that is it's also connected to a next door park, so that it's not just the gardens around, but people can actually walk to the park. We actually sometimes use the park for drumming. Between a main parking garage, parking structure for the rest of the university, and when I stand there in front of the labyrinth, we have a labyrinth, which is a walking meditation space. And sometimes when I stand there, people from the rest of the university will on purpose, instead of walking through the parking lot to their other buildings, will cut through the garden. And I've asked them, why are you doing this? They said, well, because it's just so wonderful and it's shady and it's so pleasant. So you don't have to tell people to do things if you create spaces where they want to go.
There's a lot there that I'd like to unpack. The first is the plants. I mean, outdoor, of course, everyone who has an outdoor space, I should hope, uses it. But what about indoor, in apartment buildings or places where maybe they don't have access to a garden?
Yeah, so there's at the later chapters, there are tips on how you can create the 7 domains of integrative health in your own workspace at home, or your own home. Actually, one of the readers who read my book, he said it should be called Well at Life instead of Well at Work, because there's so many tips for creating these well-being spaces anywhere where you work or play or live or learn. And in fact, we're working with a local high school to help them embed these principles into their spaces. So what can you do? Yes, plants indoors are very important. I say in the book, I say start with a window. If you have a workspace, to the extent possible, face your desk to the window so that you can look outside. If there's nature, if there are trees, you can sort of take mini moments off to just gaze, and that'll help reset the stress response and lower your stress response just a little bit. But also having the circadian light is important, and light for plants in the room. I see you have some plants behind you.
I do. This one's dry, but this one is alive very much. I'm a plant person.
Yeah. So that's great. My mother used to have so many plants, and she used to actually talk to the plants and as she watered them. And she really believed that was important. And I think she was probably right, because when you talk, you exhale carbon dioxide, and the plants take in the carbon dioxide, they clean the air, and they make sugar out of it. That's what photosynthesis is. But there are indoor hydroponic vertical gardens, which are really very successful. They come with the right kind of full spectrum sunlight boxes that help the plants grow. And in fact, if you don't have much light coming into your office space, those full spectrum sunlight boxes can also help with circadian light, help you sleep at night, and so on. So yes, plants are very important. And if you're allergic, I mean, one of the issues is if you're allergic to molds and things, plants with earth might not be the best idea for you, but the hydroponic vertical gardens are self-contained, and that avoids that problem. You won't be exposed to mold.
Yeah, I mean, I propagate all my plants and I just put them in water and it takes out that problem. Another, a space that I particularly called out, it's very much in the beginning of your book and I didn't even think that you would even mention it, but was True Food Kitchen. Can we talk about that for a quick second?
Oh
Because
yeah, True Food Kitchen.
the reason why it caught my ear was because we actually at Lily Tile, they've used a lot of our tiles on their floors. So we visited their cafes and they are just
Oh,
exceptional. And I'd love to chat about that because that's a restaurant that every time I walk in, there are plants, there's beautiful decor, the lighting, it's great lighting. Can we talk about the connection of, was it Dr.
oh,
Andrew Weil?
absolutely. Well, yeah. So Dr. Andrew Weil, we all call him Andy here. Um, he wrote the preface to the book
Yeah.
to Well at Work,
Yep.
Creating Well-Being in Any Workspace, and he tells his own story in that of how he came to Arizona, how his car broke down in the desert. He
Yeah.
was heading to California, but he ended up staying in Tucson, and the rest is history. His big focus has been healthy nutrition and a Mediterranean diet, the anti-inflammatory diet. It's been on the top 10 list of diets for, I don't know, decades. Um, and and he had the idea, I don't know, about 10, 12, 15 years ago, um, probably 15 years ago, to create a restaurant where they served healthy food instead of hamburgers and French fries and whatever. Um, and I think he had some trouble convincing chefs that this would be a good idea because they felt that, well, nobody's going to go there. But he worked with a chef to create True Food Kitchen. And it was important to him to also have the ambiance that reflected well-being, and so that's why those restaurants are really embody integrative health with plants, with indoor outdoor seating, with the comfortable lighting, and the food is amazing. Well, he ended up selling the restaurants. I think there are more than 70 now across the country. And he ended up selling them and actually turned around and gave the money to the university, which is how we ended up with our 3 buildings.
Wow.
So, yeah. But yes, so actually I was talking to a local chef, and this is something that the entertainment industry, the hospitality industry, does really well. I wrote an article for the Arizona Daily Star when post-COVID people were being mandated back to work. And I said, I live about a 10, at most 20-minute drive from 5 world-class spas. Nobody is mandating anybody to go to those spas. People go to those spas because they are designed and operated to attract people there. And that's really what we need to do with workspaces, well, and learning spaces, is I'm not saying that you should design the FBI building like a spa, but you need to have spaces that will support all of these aspects of integrative health. That's really actually in Healing Spaces, I tell this story. In Healing Spaces, the Science of Place and Well-Being, I wrote this in Washington, D.C. while I was at NIH. And I had been invited to a dinner party in Georgetown, and I was talking to the gentleman to my left, and he said, "What do you do?" And I said, "I'm writing a book about how place and space can either stress you or make you happy and calm you." And he said, "Oh, we do that all the time." And I thought, ooh, somebody else is writing this same book as me. What am I going to do? And I said, "What do you do?" And he said, "I was vice president of Disney Imagineering."
Wow.
And
That's cool.
And he said, our whole mantra at Disney was to take people from a place of fear and anxiety to one of hope and happiness through the environment and through the experiences. So I said, how do you do that? And he started to explain it to me. And I said, it'd be much better if I could get a behind the scenes tour of Disneyland. And then I'd really understand how that works. So he contacted the then vice president of Disney Imagineering, Bruce Vaughn, who very kindly gave me a behind the scenes tour with my daughter and son-in-law, who both, by the way, live in LA and are design professionals and professors at Art Center College of Design. So the three of us went on this amazing behind the scenes tour. And really what the Disney Imagineers did in the 1950s was, through trial and error, through what they knew for stage design and movie settings, is they were able to create spaces to guide people through the space at a certain pace so that they're not walking too fast or too slow, that they stop and, go into one of the stores, for example, on Main Street. You smell fudge when you're walking past it. So of course you go in. Well, they had that idea. Instead of having the vent to the roof, they put the vent to the street so that people would be attracted to go into the store, and they sell more fudge there than anywhere else in the United States. There are many, many elements that I describe in Healing Spaces that have become so ubiquitous in shopping malls and shopping centers, in stores, in restaurants, that in many ways started with this intentionality by Disney and the Disney Imagineers for creating spaces that would take people from a space or place of fear and anxiety to one of hope and happiness.
And the visible elements are key, but the invisible elements, especially the ones you speak about, like noise and scent, how can those be taken into account when designing a space?
Sure, absolutely. Very important. So one of the things we found in the first paper we published in the GSA study, the Well Built for Wellbeing studies, we found that people in the open office design settings they moved more during the day, they were less stressed at night, they slept better at night, less fatigued the next day because they were moving more. When we published that first paper in 2018, there was a hue and cry in the internet of people saying they hate their open spaces. They hate their open office design. Why is it that they hate it? It's because of the noise. Noise is the single biggest stressor in any space in open office design. And we actually did find we know that when noise is too loud, it actually damages the ear. Many studies in, for example, emergency rooms or intensive care units have found that the noise level can be over 90 decibels, which is the loudness of a motorcycle firing at close range. And that damages your ear. That's extremely stressful. But we also found that when it's too quiet, your stress response is higher. And there's a sweet spot for noise level, about 45 decibels, where the relaxation response, the well-being response is optimal. Now, how do you design for that? I was talking to the general manager of our local Arizona Public Media radio television station here, and they were designing a new studios. And he said, we start with acoustical engineers. If you're designing a studio for recording sound or video, you know that the first thing you need to do is work with an acoustical engineer to make sure that the sound levels are optimal, not too high, not too low, that the sound is directed. Every single building material has an acoustical rating. You know this with your tiles, right? Mm-hmm. There's acoustical ratings for everything. And it's a no-brainer that when you design an office space, you should design with the acoustical rating in mind. So in our office, we have open office spaces, and in those spaces, There are acoustical tiles. There are baffles on the ceiling that absorb sound and direct it. The ducts above the baffles are wrapped in acoustic material. There's carpets in the open areas, and it's really quiet. It's actually very quiet, even though it's a very large space. So yes, I actually wrote I write a Psychology Today, a monthly blog for Psychology Today, and I wrote one about the invisible stressors in your workspace, and certainly sound levels are very important. You talked about smells, scents. One of the things about cubicles are the worst, because they give you a sense of visual privacy, but you don't have acoustic privacy, and you don't have odor privacy. If the person in the next cubicle is eating a garlic onion burger, it's going to float over the cubicle, and you may think you're protected from viruses or whatever, but just as the smell floats over the cubicle, so do viruses and molds and allergens and so on. So it's very important to, what helps get rid of those odors? Good airflow. A musty smell is a signal that there is a problem with the airflow. Musty also could be a problem with mold. So those are things that need to be addressed really very, very meticulously. It's not a good idea to put fake chemical air fresheners into spaces, because all that does is it covers it up, and you can be allergic to those chemicals. They're harmful. Now, if you want to use a little bit of aromatherapy of essential oils, that can be okay. It also depends on the other people around, who might be overly sensitive, and you don't want to have that problem.
So in terms of the sound and the airflow, that's when designing the space. What about once you're in the space? Does it take a large financial overhaul to create a space that's good for working in and better for our bodies?
Well, what can you do if you can't redesign the acoustics and so on? The great thing about modern technology is there's all kinds of devices now where you can have your own local sound, white noise, nature sounds. Nature sounds are calming. They reduce stress. They help you fall asleep. You can certainly wear earphones. And in terms of design, office design, if it's an open office design, there's also ways to place noisy machines in such a way that they're not close to where the people are working. So the layout is important, and those things can be moved around. There's thoughtful ways of reducing sound in that regard. I have in Well at Work, the last chapters are about the future, and what I would envision is, the movie Get Smart?
No, I don't think I've seen it.
That really dates me. Well, there's it's a funny movie about a clumsy spy, and there's this cone of silence that descends over. This may ring a bell. A cone of silence that descends over them, and it's really very funny, because then they can't talk and whatever. But it is possible now. If you go to a museum, you will stand in front of a painting, and there'll be a cone of sound that explains what the painting is about. It is possible to direct sound in such a way that it can not bother the person next door to you. And those things are feasible. You're not going to do that at home, but those kinds of technologies are feasible and are coming online.
What about the things that you can do at home for all our listeners who work from home? besides for getting near a
Well,
window?
yeah. Window, as I said, plants. Lighting is really important. As I said, full spectrum sunlight boxes so that you get that healthy blue light in the morning, redder light in the evening. Looking at a screen which has blue light for 30 minutes in the evening is as stimulating as a cup of coffee. So you can actually get glasses, lenses that block out blue light. So I actually have a pair of glasses that see they have a sort of a bluish rim to remind me that these have lenses that block out blue light. So if I have to do any work in the evening, I wear those glasses. So you can do that as well. Um, Reminding yourself to get up. Sitting is the new smoking. It's not good to be sedentary. And, you should be getting up, stretching every 20 minutes or so. If you have a health tracker, it'll remind you. And sometimes I tell it to not remind me, but, it's important to do that. Get up and walk around. If it's an apartment or outside, take a walk outside to breathe in some fresh air and energize you. I visited a teddy bear factory in Vermont where the workers, every 20 minutes, they play dance music, and all the workers get up and they do their little dance, and then they sit down, and it's wonderful. So there activities that you can do, and there are ways that you can design your spaces to optimize well-being. One thing I wanted to mention in terms of technologies is that I didn't mention is our recharge room in the Andrew Weil Center for Integrative Medicine. And I can tell that story now, or you wanted to ask a question about
please,
home because
please. I'm excited to hear it.
It's an immersive nature reality experience where you sit in a room and you see about 8 different nature scenes, and you call out elsewhere, take me to, you pick one, a misty mountain lake. And the whole wall lights up, and it's a misty mountain lake, and you hear the birds chirping and the water lapping, and you see a canoe going. It's very calming. This was created by a young woman named Morel Phillips, who had been in the video game industry and then was in a serious accident and had neurotrauma, and she was in hospital and was desperate to be in nature and couldn't. And she shared with me that she'd read my previous book, Healing Spaces, and had an aha moment and decided that she was going to quit the video game industry and set up this studio, which she called Studio Elsewhere, in New York City as soon as she got better, and to create these immersive nature reality spaces. And that was in 2019. 2020 happened. She realized she was at ground zero for burnout, suicidality, depression, anxiety in healthcare professionals, and quickly ramped up with Mount Sinai Hospital to create recharge rooms for health professionals. She had even one in a triage tent for COVID in New York City, and now has well over 70 across the country in hospitals. As she has one in our space, created one for the high school that we're working with, because the stress is a big issue amongst students and teachers. And one of the great things that she's doing is research on the usage of the rooms and the impact on stress, anxiety, depression, burnout, and so on, and is finding that 15 minutes a day, this is the dose effect of being in this nature reality space. 15 minutes a day reduces depression, reduces burnout, reduces anxiety, improves sleep quality, even improves teaming amongst members in the organization. And we've actually collaborated with her and her team at Mount Sinai. And we find that 15 minutes a day also reduces cortisol, the stress hormone cortisol. So there's no question that being in nature, whether in real nature, which we've also done studies on that. There are many studies showing that being in nature reduces stress. But being in this nature virtual reality space also is a way of reducing stress in larger spaces, in hospitals and elsewhere. So I tell that story in Well at Work as well.
Yeah, and I love that, because also something you mentioned is, instead of having a nature space, you can have art on the wall that is a beautiful landscape, and that your body doesn't know the difference, and it actually calms you down as well. So it's nice to see technology also being in that same vein as of calming us down, even if we don't have access to the real space, the real outdoor space.
I mean, obviously, it's best to be, and this is what's called forest bathing, being in nature, walking slowly, calmly, breathing deeply, experiencing all the wonderful fragrances from the plants, which are called biogenic volatile organic compounds, that actually are chemicals that reduce stress, reduce anxiety, and can actually help you heal. You hear the nature sounds. It's being in this surround sound experience of nature is optimal. But if you can't, you can look at a picture, a photograph, a view of nature. You can inhale the aromatherapy, forest bathing aromatherapies. You can get that online. You can listen to nature sounds, or you can do all of the above and recreate, to the extent possible, being in real nature.
It's so cool, because I read somewhere, maybe you can confirm it, that the reason why bird song is so calming for us as humans is because birds chirp when it's safe. And so our bodies recognize that it's safe and there's no threat. Whereas when there are threats, birds are not chirping.
That is really wonderful. I love that. I thought you were going in a different direction, because in our GSA study, where we found the optimal decibel level for well-being response, that was 45 decibels, which is the same level as birdsong.
Wow.
So that's really interesting. That may be why birds tell you, okay, this is the well-being space here.
Right. Physiologically, we
I love
think
it.
we're so evolved, but really, we're not that evolved when you think about it. And that's something you mentioned as well. You've studied everything from hospitals to offices to natural landscapes. Are there design elements that, besides for the invisible things, but actual tangible design elements that you've seen consistently support resilience and emotional regulation, regardless of the scale? So we've talked about light, we've talked about sound, we've talked about scent. What about the things that we can touch?
That's interesting. Certainly touch is an important, it's important. So let me go back. Healing spaces, the book is structured around sensory neuroscience. How does what you see and hear and smell and touch and do in a space affect your moods? And we know that touch is an important element of reducing stress. There are studies, John Cacioppo did these many, many years ago, showing that heart rate variability, which is a measure of your stress and relaxation response, is very much affected by holding hands with a loved one. So touch is really important. There's studies in newborns showing that massage therapy, massaging newborns, premature babies, actually enhances gastric juices and digestion, and reduces stress. So touch is very important, as is temperature, by the way. We didn't talk about temperature. And we found in the GSA studies that it's actually not so much the temperature as the humidity which matters. So we found that when the humidity is less than 30% or greater than 60% relative humidity, the stress response is 25% higher. Now, if you are sitting in a too dry or too wet space every single day of your life, and your stress response is 25% higher every single day, that amounts to a medically relevant cumulative amount of stress. And so regulating the humidity, the temperature is important. Now, one of the problems with temperature is that everybody has a different set point for how comfortable they are. I mean, everybody knows about thermostat wars, right? People want it colder. Typically, women want it warmer, and men want it colder in office spaces, possibly because of the way they dress. If a man is wearing a heavy suit, compared to a woman with a light summer dress, then but still our metabolisms are different. So again, one of the great things about being in this era of technology is that many technologies are being developed for personalized spaces. So you can actually get office chairs that heat or cool, just the way this has been around in automobiles for a long time. Heated seats, cooling seats, cooling steering wheels, and so on. And that can also both save on the cost of heating a whole building, or dehumidifying or humidifying a whole building for one size fits all when one size fits no one. So again, if we talk about humidity, it's very dry here in Arizona. You have a desk humidifier. You have a desk dehumidifier.
How much does a sense of control impact stress in the ability to change the temperature?
Really, really, really important. And that's partly why people prefer to work from home. You have control at home. You don't in an office space. And there's no question that there's a relationship between control and the stress response. If you're in a high stress, low control situation, you will feel stressed. If you're in a high stress, high control situation, you'll feel exhilarated, which, going back to Disney, by the way, is another principle of those rides. The reason that people love to be on those, theme park rides is because they have a sense of control over that otherwise very stressful experience. And so they feel exhilarated. So yes, a sense of control is very, very important. And again, having local, right around your desk, devices that help with sound, with temperature, with humidity, with airflow, with light, to your optimal of what you prefer, will give you a real sense of control, even if you're in the middle of an open office setting. Also, having the opportunity to go to different spaces when you need to gives you a sense of control.
In terms of looking forward, what would you like to see more of in buildings and workspaces? Is it giving the individual employees or team members control, or is it just taking all of this into consideration? What do you want to see more of?
All of the above.
All of the above.
I want to see more. I want to see more of the bottom line of priorities, budget priorities, turned to creating physically healthy and emotionally well-being spaces for all. I think that is absolutely essential. And unfortunately, it has not been a priority until now. It's beginning to be more so. But it's easy, it's easy when budgets are being cut to say, okay, we're not going to have access to the outdoors. We don't need, it costs a lot to maintain these plants, and so on. But if what you focus on is your personnel's well-being, and realize, actually, there's a lot of studies that are beginning to be done now for return on investment of spending money to create these well-being spaces. And Casey Lindbergh authored one of those studies. There's a study that shows that lack of sleep for any reason, whether it's medical or whether it's all of what I talked about before, costs the organization about $3,500 a year per employee.
Wow.
When you add that up, that's an awful lot of money. So it's worth to do what you can to help people to be healthy. There's There's triple bottom line studies, which again show something in that general range of $3,000 a person when you design for well-being, that is saved. And because you have less absenteeism, less presenteeism. Presenteeism means that you're at work, but you're sick and you're not really doing much. So the cost of healthcare, insurance, and so on, you can add all of these things up, and it costs a lot of money to an organization to have people who are not happy, healthy, and productive. And if that can be revealed through more ROI studies, so that more organizations will put a priority on creating spaces for health and well-being. And the other thing that needs to be done, which we found from our pre-post occupancy surveys, you can create these spaces, but if you don't program them, people may not take advantage of them. So it helps to have somebody who is in charge of programming spaces, maybe a yoga break or an exercise break, or different kinds of activities. We have cooking classes. We have a teaching kitchen in our Candor building, in the multi-purpose building, which can be used. The building can be used as a classroom, as gathering space, teaching. It's very popular. This teaching kitchen is popular not only with the staff, but with the rest of the university, but also the community around. And you don't have to do all of that, but there are things that can be done to help people engage in these healthy domains of integrative health. And if the priority is set from above, I think we'll have a lot happier and healthier workforce, and people will want to go back to these common workspaces to, be nourished by them.
It's like that you mentioned in the book, Google's offices in California with the bikes and the outdoor spaces and the bright colors. And the individual that you interviewed that decided to go to Google or go to a a tech company because they were offering so many things, including all of this well-being, whether it's daycare or it's laundry services or things to make their employees' lives easier.
Yeah, and they actually have free, wonderful food. Everybody goes to the cafeteria to get this delicious food, and that means that they're gathering. You have the benefit of relationships. A number of these tech companies are doing that. Microsoft, Apple created a new headquarters. They call it a donut because it's sort of a circular thing with a space in the middle, but it is on purpose surrounded by green grounds, forest area where people can wander and walk and meditate and think and rejuvenate. So yes, there are a number of organizations that are doing that and do see a benefit in terms of bottom line. Now, you want to know what else in the future? I think in the future, technologies will allow more personalized spaces, to be able to have control and create your own personalized soundscape, your personalized temperature, humidity, lighting, and so on, even if you're in a common space. And I think the technologies for that are really very exciting that are coming online.
I agree. So one final question I have for you that we like to ask everyone, since this is a show about interior design and spaces, is there a space that has changed you for who you are today? It could be past, it could be present, but a space that really, it could have been a space that you grew up in or something that took your breath away, but is there a space that you really feel that changed you as a person?
It's a great question. And yes, the Greece experience, there's no question that being in Lentas, in that tiny village on the island of Crete, really, really changed me. And it made me realize that lifestyle, that connection with nature, connection with the rhythms of the seasons and the sun, the connection with the others in the village, and the way one of the things about that village is you couldn't drive. The streets are too narrow, so you have to walk. And then you swim every day. And the spaces to meditate. I mean, there's no question that changed me. In thinking about it, and I've talked to my neighbors, the Papavasilius, with whom I went there, about this. And I said, it's a little strange that you just immediately asked me to go to Crete and you didn't know me. And I immediately said yes. But what I realized in retrospect is that it's because they reminded me of my parents, that they came with European accents. They came with the same food that my mother made. So there was a familiarity there. And being in Crete, in Greece, immediately I felt at home because it reminded me of the way I was brought up by my European parents. And then when I did some work on my house in Washington, D.C., and I put in a new deck, only at the very end, when it was finished, did I realize I'd recreated my mother's deck from home in Montreal.
Wow.
And the architect had said to me, you have this big holly tree. If you cut down the holly tree, you can make the deck wider. And I said, no, I have to keep the holly tree because I love the holly tree. Well, I didn't realize until after I had done that my mother had done the same thing. She had a beautiful lilac tree outside her deck, and the architect said, if you cut down the lilac tree, you can make the deck bigger. And she said, no, I have to have the lilac tree. So I think there are elements of my experience in Greece that did bring me back to my childhood at home, and those spaces that were so nurturing. I tell the story of, in Healing Spaces, in the last chapter, I tell the story of how I would sit when I was in kindergarten or grade 1 with my father sitting outside on our deck and at breakfast. And every once in a while, he'd look up from his book. He'd be always reading a book and he said, listen to the sounds of peace. Now, he had been in the war. In retrospect, that was not even 10 years after the war. He'd been in a concentration camp in Russia during the war. And so he was very aware of, the sounds of peace. I didn't know what he meant. All I heard was a dog barking and the tennis balls across the street and, the wind. But what he made me realize is that you should be in the moment and you should appreciate everything in the moment. And in that book, in Healing Spaces, in that chapter, I talk about his favorite psalm was the 23rd. That psalm captures everything about a healing space. Beside the still waters, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil. And that really tells you how deep in our psyche is the importance of a healing space, even if you are in the valley of the shadow of death. And I think that's what sustained him through that horrible concentration camp experience. And it stayed with him and transmitted it to us, to my sister and me, as we would sit on my parents' deck in Montreal.
That's so beautiful. And thank you for sharing that. It's funny how things come full circle and we don't even realize them until much later, that the things that impact us and really make us who we are and make us appreciate the things we do. Dr. Sternberg, that is so beautiful, and thank you so much for being on the podcast. You have shared a wealth of wisdom with us, and I'm so grateful to have had the opportunity to speak with you. It's not every day that you get to speak to an author you admire. So thank you for your time. Thank you for your brain and your wisdom. And I know our listeners are going to get a lot out of this episode.
Well, thank you so much. It's not every day that I hear my readers who who've been inspired. So thank you very much. This has been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much for spending this time with me on Room to Think. If you enjoyed this episode, feel free to follow the show, subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who you think would really appreciate a more thoughtful approach to their space. You can find more design meets psychology insights on social, in our community, and definitely in upcoming episodes so you can build a better life by design. Thanks again for listening. I'll see you next time.